In the autumn of 331 BCE, on a broad, open plain in what is now northern Iraq, two worlds faced each other for the last time. To the east stood the army of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, commanded by King Darius III. This was the empire that had once reached from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean, that had threatened Greece at Marathon and Thermopylae, that had ruled cities like Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis in magnificent wealth. To the west stood a much smaller army led by a young Macedonian king, Alexander, whom later generations would call the Great. He had already defeated Persian armies at the Granicus River and at Issus. Now he had marched deep into the heart of Persian territory to force a final decision. The ancient Greeks would call this clash the Battle of Gaugamela, after a small village near the field. Some writers also speak of it as the Battle of Arbela, after the bigger city nearby. Today, most historians believe the battlefield lay on the plain near modern Tel Gomel, in the Nineveh region of northern Iraq, not far from Mosul and Erbil. What is now farmland and Kurdish and Arab villages, crossed by modern roads and power lines, was once the stage for one of the most decisive battles in ancient history. After his defeat at Issus a few years earlier, Darius had retreated eastward. He had seen his family captured by Alexander, his prestige shaken, but he still commanded the resources of a vast empire. In the time between Issus and Gaugamela, he and his satraps called up new troops from Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Iran, and beyond. They assembled cavalry from the plains, archers from the east, Greek mercenaries, and noble Persian guards. If he could win one great battle, he might still throw the invaders back into the west. Alexander, for his part, did not stand still after Issus. He moved down the eastern Mediterranean coast, taking Tyre and Gaza, then went to Egypt, where he was hailed as a liberator and founded the city of Alexandria. From there, he returned to the Levant and pushed north and east, following ancient roads into Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Scouts brought word that Darius was waiting with a massive army near Arbela, on a plain that the Persians had chosen carefully. It was open and flat, ideal for deploying large numbers of cavalry and the terrifying scythed chariots that Darius hoped would break Alexander's infantry. Persian engineers even worked to smooth and clear parts of the terrain so that the chariots could roll unhindered. As Alexander's forces approached, they moved cautiously. He did not want to be surprised or forced to fight on too unfavorable terms. Reconnaissance parties rode ahead. One such group, according to ancient sources, nearly stumbled into a Persian advance unit at night. Both sides withdrew quickly, not yet ready for the full clash. Eventually, Alexander climbed a low ridge from which he could survey the Persian deployment. Before him lay a sea of tents and troops, horses and chariots. The Persian center was thick with infantry, Persians themselves, Medes, other subject peoples, and Greek mercenaries who had hired themselves out to the great king. On the wings, strong masses of cavalry waited, including fearsome contingents from Bactria and other eastern provinces. In front of the line, like sharp teeth placed at the edge of a jaw, stood scythed chariots, war carts with blades attached to their wheels, designed to slice through enemy ranks. Many of Alexander's officers were impressed and perhaps intimidated. Their own army was relatively small, in the tens of thousands rather than the probable 100,000 or more that Darius had assembled. But Alexander saw something else. A large, rigid formation that needed space to move, that could be powerful on open ground, but could become unwieldy if drawn out of shape. On the night before the battle, in a camp pitched somewhere on that plain near modern Gomel, Alexander held council with his generals. Some advised a surprise night attack, hoping to reduce the advantage of Persian numbers and disrupt their formation before it could take shape. Alexander refused. He is said to have argued that he did not want to steal his victory in the dark. He wanted the world to see that he had beaten the great king in open battle, under the eye of the sun. So he let his men sleep, as much as they could. They had faced Persian armies before. They knew what they were capable of and what they themselves could do. On the other side, in the vast Persian camp, the night must have been filled with activity, horses being checked, chariots inspected, armor made ready, orders passed from tent to tent. At dawn, the two armies formed their lines. Darius placed himself in the center in a high chariot, surrounded by his elite guard. From there, he could see much of the field. Scythed chariots waited in front of his main infantry, ready to be loosed. The right and left wings bristled with cavalry. He hoped to envelop Alexander's smaller force, to crush it between pounding hooves and flashing blades. Alexander, for his part, did not stand still after Issus. He moved his men with care. In the center, he placed the Macedonian phalanx, rows and rows of infantrymen armed with long sarissa spears, up to 6 meters in length. Behind their forest of points, the men wore armor, carried small shields, and moved as a single machine. On his right, Alexander took command of the companion cavalry, his best horsemen, along with the elite hypaspist infantry who would guard the crucial gap between horse and foot. On the left, he placed Thessalian cavalry and other allied Greek horsemen under the experienced general Parmenion. Reserve troops, additional infantry and cavalry, waited behind the main line, ready to plug gaps or exploit opportunities. Between the two armies stretched an expanse of dry, flattened plain, dotted here and there with small irregularities. Behind Darius lay his camp and the road back towards Arbela. Behind Alexander lay the lands he had just crossed, and much farther away, the mountains that led back to the Mediterranean. Now, on the same ground where today Kurdish and Arab farmers plow fields and tend flocks near villages like Tel Gomel, the fate of the Persian Empire would be decided. As the morning sun rose higher, dust already began to hang in the air. The first movements were cautious. Skirmishers, light troops with javelins and bows, advanced to probe and harass. Persian archers loosed volleys at long range, their arrows beginning to fall among the Macedonian ranks. Then the heavier forces began to move. Darius wanted to use his long line and superior cavalry. Alexander, aware of this, did something subtle. Instead of marching straight ahead, he began to angle his right wing slowly towards the Persian left, as if trying to slip away in that direction. The Persian left, unwilling to let him escape, extended outward to match him. In doing so, they stretched their line and drew themselves away from the solid center. At the same time, Alexander's center advanced cautiously, not letting itself get too far ahead. Parmenian's left moved more slowly, trying to hold its ground against the weight of Persian cavalry opposite. Seeing the enemy within range, Darius sent forward his scythed chariots. The chariots thundered across the plain, blades flashing, wheels kicking up clouds of dust. They were meant to carve gaping holes in the enemy formation to frighten men into scattering. But Alexander had prepared for this. His light infantry, peltasts, and archers ran out ahead of the phalanx and targeted the chariot horses and drivers with javelins and arrows. Some chariots were brought down before they reached the main line. Others, their teams wounded and frightened, veered off to the sides. As for the chariots that made it to the phalanx, the Macedonian spearmen had been trained to part their ranks at the last moment, opening lanes for the vehicles to pass through harmlessly. Men on either side stabbed at the passing crews. By the time the chariots reached the rear of the formation, many were out of control or abandoned. The terrifying weapon that Darius hoped would shatter Alexander's infantry instead dissolved in confusion and blood. Now the main clash began. On the Macedonian left, Parmenians' forces felt the full weight of Persian cavalry, including elite squadrons from the far reaches of the empire. Horses collided, lances thrust, men fought at close range while trying to keep their seats. Dust and noise made command difficult. At times, it looked like it might be overwhelmed Alexander's left wing. In the center, the Macedonian phalanx met the Persian infantry and Greek mercenaries serving Darius. The long sarissas gave the Macedonians a reach advantage. Several ranks could strike at once, their spearheads glinting like a wall of metal. Persian soldiers, armed with shorter spears and swords, had to get past that hedge of points to do real damage. Some did, but many fell before they closed the distance. Alexander, meanwhile, continued to maneuver on the right. His angle away from the Persian center pulled part of the Persian left wing with him. The rigid symmetry of Darius's line began to warp. Gaps appeared. The precisely arranged troops no longer stood where Darius expected them to be. At the chosen moment, Alexander launched his decisive move. With a shouted order and a blast of trumpets, he formed his companion cavalry into a wedge and drove them not directly at the wing, but obliquely inward, aiming at the gap that had opened in front of the Persian center and Darius himself. Hypaspists and other infantry moved up to cover their flank. The ground shook as hundreds of armored horses pounded forward. The impact was enormous. Macedonian lances crashed into Persian guards and infantry. For a brief, terrible span of time, the battle swirled right in front of Darius's chariot. Macedonian fighters were now within sight of the great king. Some glimpsed him, tall crown and ornate armor standing out amid the chaos. From his vantage point, Darius saw his left in trouble, his center under direct assault, his right deeply engaged. He knew that if he were killed or captured, the political heart of the empire would be shattered. Facing the dust cloud of Alexander's charge and the pressure on his line, Darius made a decision that would define the battle. He turned his chariot and fled. Once their king fled, the cohesion of the Persian center began to crumble. Men who had been fighting fiercely now looked around and saw only dust, confusion, and absence of leadership. Units started to give ground, then to run. Some may have tried to stand and buy time for Darius's escape, but the overall momentum had shifted. On Alexander's left, however, things were still dangerous. Parmenion, pressed hard by Persian cavalry, sent desperate messages asking for help. According to some accounts, an opening had even appeared in the Macedonian line there, through which Persian horsemen raided toward the baggage camp. Alexander, having driven the king from the field, now faced a choice: continue to pursue Darius with his fresh cavalry and perhaps end the campaign swiftly, or turn back to save his embattled left wing. He chose to help his own army. He wheeled his companion cavalry around and rode across the field toward Parmenion. When his heavy horsemen crashed into the Persian cavalry that had been threatening the left, the effect was decisive. Attacked now from a new direction, and with news of the king's flight spreading, the Persian riders lost heart. One by one, their formations broke and scattered, galloping away from the killing ground toward whatever safety they could find. By late in the day, organized Persian resistance had collapsed. Pockets of soldiers still fought or hid, but the great army that had assembled on the Gaugamela plain, on the soil of what is now northern Iraq, was finished as a coherent force. Behind the broken lines, the enormous Persian camp beckoned. Macedonian and Greek soldiers advanced cautiously at first, then more boldly, breaking through its defenses. Inside, they found a world of rich tents, fine rugs, gold cups, silver bowls, and luxurious furnishings. The contrast between the rough field life of their own camp and the opulence of the Persian one was stark. They also found prisoners, servants, families, and perhaps slaves taken in earlier campaigns. For some, freedom came in the midst of destruction. For others, captivity simply changed hands. Alexander walked the field and the camp, absorbing what had happened. He had won battles before, at the Granicus, at Issus, but Gaugamela was different. It was the last chance Darius had to stop him with a single blow. Now the road to the heartlands of the empire lay open. In the days that followed, Alexander marched toward Babylon, the great city on the Euphrates. The gates opened to him. Babylonian nobles greeted him as a new lord, offering gifts and control. From there, he would go on to Susa, Persepolis, and beyond, but the real breaking of Persian power in the west had come on that flattened plain near Gaugamela. Today, if you travel through northern Iraq in the Nineveh governorate near Mosul and Erbil, you will see fields of grain, orchards, and villages like Tel Gomel. Kurdish and Arab families live in concrete houses, ride motorbikes and tractors, go to school and work the land. Road signs in Arabic and Kurdish mark routes along highways where Alexander's men once walked on foot, sweating under bronze and iron. There are no towering monuments on the battlefield itself, no obvious scars on the land to show where phalanx met cavalry. The traces that remain lie mostly beneath the surface, a scatter of ancient metal, the subtle shapes of old earthworks, the descriptions preserved in Greek and Roman texts. Historians and archaeologists, using those texts along with satellite imagery and surveys, have narrowed down the likely area of the battle. They compare the shape of the hills, the course of small streams, and the distance to known ancient towns. The consensus points to the Gomel Plain, not far from where children now play football and farmers harvest wheat. In classrooms and documentaries, maps of Gaugamela show colored blocks representing armies. Tiny arrows show Alexander's diagonal advance, the scythed chariot charge, the fateful cavalry wedge that split the Persian center. These diagrams try to make sense of something that, on the ground, must have felt overwhelming, tens of thousands of lives crashing together in dust and fear and determination. When we speak of Gaugamela today, we are speaking of a turning point. After this battle, Alexander was no longer just a bold invader, he was effectively the new master of the western half of the Persian Empire. The old royal line of Darius would soon fall. Power, culture, and wealth would begin to flow in new directions, mixing Greek and Eastern traditions in what we now call the Hellenistic world. And yet, for all its grand consequences, the battlefield itself is just a patch of earth in what is now northern Iraq, a place where people still plant, harvest, and live their everyday lives, mostly unaware that under their feet lies the ghost of a day when a Macedonian king and a Persian emperor fought for the future of an empire on the plain of Gaugamela.